Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to another fantastic journey into Likutei Sichos, the Rabbi's magnum opus, 39 edited works, volumes of edited works of the Rabbi. And each time I have an opportunity to study properly and to try to teach one of these Sichos, it's like, wow, each one is like its own wow. So here's another wow, just the way the Rebbe approaches everything from such a novel approach. This Sicha, as you will see, is special in its own way. The Rebbe is addressing a specific Talmudic or biblical nuance. So in that way, it's a Sicha dealing with a nuance of Talmudic literature based on the Torah. But the then takeaway, though, and the resolution that the Rebbe introduces is very general in its scope. As you'll see, it's very general and useful for Jews who are curious about the way Torah works. So there is a verse in our portion of Teruma which is ambiguous. Now, you might be laughing. Everything in Torah is ambiguous. There are multi-layers of interpretation on every verse in Torah. It's true. However, the Talmud makes a statement that there are 5 verses which are inconclusive. Only 5. Again, every verse has, let's call it 70 layers of interpretation and commentary, but there are 5 verses which, I guess on the literal level, it's inconclusive. There's a word that could be read as an extension of the prior section or as introduction to the next section. And the Talmud makes a statement that these 5 are inconclusive. We don't know how to read them, which is so interesting, how Torah always remains with a question mark, which makes it interesting. And one of those 5 verses in this portion, and that's what this discussion becomes about. So, on your screen, you have the 5 verses. The first one is the verse of our Torah portion. In Hebrew, Bamenorah arba geviyim mushukadim kaftoreha ufracheha. In English, the menorah's center branch, there were 4 goblets engraved, its knobs and its flowers. The menorah had many decorations. It was a beautiful ornament. It was a solid piece of gold, chiseled out, and part of the ornaments of it, that there were goblets out of gold, upside down goblets for design, flowers for design, and knobs, like these bowls, like buttons for design, in various places, a whole bunch of them. And it gave it design and taste. And it was also a concept of mishukadim, that they were engraved. The word mishukadim comes from the word shaked, which is an almond. And because an almond is shaped with like chisels, right? An almond is not smooth. An almond is shaped with like chisels in it, which makes it interesting. So this was a special craftsmanship, that they would take the gold and they would make it mishukadim, which means, we're translating it as engraved, but I guess the literal translation would be engraved almond-like. Designed with that design, that the gold on the menorah is not smooth, but rather it's chiseled, which makes it special. Incidentally, some commentaries say mishukadim is also includes within it the word shaked. Shaked can mean diligent. Diligent. When we went to yeshiva, one of the marks on our report card was shakida. What is your diligence? How interested, how attuned are you to your learning? How alacrity, the alacrity that you have, are you into it? Incidentally, it's believed by some that the word shaked, which could be diligence, is also from the root of almonds, because almonds are alacritous in their growth. In a very, very short time, they sprout up, much more so than other things that grows. And therefore, it all goes together. Bottom line is that the menorah's goblets, says the Torah, the menorah in the center branch, those goblets were designed mishukadim, in a special, diligent fashion, to be beautifully designed, almond-like. And then it says the knobs and the flowers. And the question is, that word mishukadim, engraved, that's the translation I'm using for simplicity throughout our class. That word, does it apply to the goblets, or does it apply to the knobs and the flowers? That's the question. And the Talmud says, we don't know. It's inconclusive. And while we're at it, for the sake of completion, I'm also quoting the other 4 verses that are also not conclusive. In Genesis, God tells Cain, after he sinned, and Cain said, oh, God, can't you forgive me? You know what I mean? So God said, if you will improve, it will stand. If you won't improve, the sin crouches at the door. That word se'es, it will stand. It can mean if you will improve, it will stand in the sense that you'll be forgiven. Or it can be if you'll improve, good. But if not, if you will not improve, then it will stand. So it goes to the second half of the verse. The third verse is Genesis chapter 49, verse 6. When Jacob is rebuking his son Shimon and his son Levi for their behavior and their violence, etc., all with good intention, but nevertheless. And the 2 things he rebuked them is that they sold Joseph into slavery and that they destroyed the people of Sodom, of Shechem. All righteous indignation, but it was a violent thing to do. Maybe it was dangerous to do, whatever. So the verse is, they desired to uproot an ox. Their rage is fierce. But in the middle, there's a word cursed. So it can be read, they desire to uproot an ox, period. Cursed is their rage. Arur apam. Which is the way it's read if you go by the punctuation of the verse. It's a new verse. But remember, in Torah, there's no punctuation. So ultimately, you can read it in the other way. And that is, they wanted to uproot an ox that's cursed. If you read it the way we have it in our punctuation, that cursed is the beginning of the next verse, that cursed is their anger, that their fierce rage. The prior verse is referring to Joseph, that they wanted to uproot an ox. Joseph is compared to an ox. But if you read it as a cursed ox, that would be a reference to the destruction of the people of Shechem, who is compared to a cursed ox. So we don't know. Another verse is Moses tells Joshua, go out and wage war against Amalek. Tomorrow, I will go up to the hilltop and carry the staff of God and say my prayers. What is tomorrow? Is tomorrow an instruction that that's when Joshua should wage war with Amalek, or is tomorrow an information that that's the time when Moses is going to go onto the hilltop? We don't know. Again, the punctuation has it as one of the 2 ways in each case. However, ultimately, the Torah is also to be seen without any punctuation. And ultimately, the Talmud says that this verse is inconclusive. We don't really know how it was meant to be read, so to speak. I guess the net would be is read it both ways, what have you. Finally, the 5th is in Deuteronomy, when God is telling Moses at the end, you're going to pass away and rise up. Now, this nation will go astray. What does rise up? Does that mean that you're going to pass away and then you will rise up, referring to resurrection, which is a hint in the Torah to the future resurrection? Or is it you're going to pass away and this nation will rise up and go astray? We don't know. So these are the 5 verses. I wanted to include this. The Rabbi does mention them briefly in the Sicha on a few occasions, or one occasion, but it becomes relevant, as we'll see, to know what these are. But it's also good general knowledge, but it's helpful to understanding of our Sicha as well. So we have 5 verses that are inconclusive, but let's zero in to the first verse on the screen, which is our verse in the menorah. They're center branch, as opposed to the other 6. There were 4 goblets engraved, its knobs and its flowers. And we don't know which way to go. We're not sure what does engraved mean. Remember, engraved means that chiseled beautification. Does that apply to the goblets, or does it apply to the knobs and the flowers? It's important to know what's the instruction. Now, on the screen, you have a design of the menorah. I'm assuming people are a little bit familiar. Today, you can Google it, but you have a little bit of an idea what the menorah looked like. It was a height of 18 handbreadths. It's the equivalent of 3 amos, the biblical measure. An am is approximately 1.5 feet. So if it's 3 amos, it's approximately 4.5 feet tall. It's not very tall, but it's very elegant. It's very heavy. It's a solid kikar, which is a measurement of gold, and they chiseled out all these things. It's very, very nuanced. As you take a look closely, you can see that by each of the 7 branches, there's a flower on top, and then there is a knob, that round ball. It's all decorative. And clearly it's Torah, it's the temple. So there's tremendous biblical, Kabbalistic, spiritual implications. But for the face of it, it's also ornamental. And then there are these 3 cups upside down. And then there's the knobs in the middle. And then again at the bottom of the middle branch, there's additional knob and 3 knobs, and then a flower at the bottom. So you have an idea a little bit of what these details are. And the question is becoming this special touch, meshukadim, almond-like engraving. It's special. It was a famous thing. Rambam writes elsewhere that this was a well-known craftsmanship. You bought a Kiddush cup. Is it meshukadim? And you bought a Shabbat candlestick set. Did you get it meshukadim? You know what I mean? It would be equivalent today. Is it 925 silver? You know what I mean? It's a special craftsmanship. And in verse 34, what does the Torah mean? Is it just on the goblets, or is it just on the knobs and the flowers? Now, 33, the verse prior, is referring to the 6 other branches of the menorah. Remember, it's a 7-branch menorah. There's the middle branch, and then there's 3 and 3. The prior verse says 3 goblets engraved on each branch, a knob and a flower. ... It repeats it. 3 goblets engraved on the 3 other branches, a knob and a flower. And the same applies to all 6 branches. So 33 also has this word meshukadim engraved, but in 33 it's quite clear that it refers to the goblets, because a knob and a flower is the second half of the verse. 3 goblets engraved on each branch. And then it says a knob and a flower. So engraved, remember, engraved is an operative word of this Sicha. It's a loaded word. It means fancy. 3 goblets engraved on each branch. Clearly, in verse 33, it applies only to the goblets. And then it says a knob and a flower. That's like later in the verse. Because if it wanted the engraved to be referring to the knob and a flower, it should have said 3 goblets on each branch, engraved a knob and a flower. It doesn't say that. It says engraved before the words on each branch. So clearly, in verse 33, there isn't a question that it refers, the engraving, the fanciness, refers to the goblets, not to the knob and flower. In verse 34 is where it's curious. Says the Rambam in Jewish law, it's right in the middle of the screen, all were engraved, the goblets, knobs, and flowers on all 7 branches, unquote. That's the Rambam's ruling. Since the verse is vague, so we don't know if it goes on the goblets that are before it or on the knobs and the flowers that are after. We do both. Heck, for good measure, we use all 7, not just the middle branch. This is the law. This is how the temple was actually built, or the Mishkan, or whatever, all the menorahs that were built. Says the Kesef Mishnah, which is a classic commentary, a very important commentary. The author of the Kesef Mishnah, this is arguably the main commentary on Rambam. Who's the author of the Kesef Mishnah? The Beit Yosef, the one who will later write the Code of Jewish Law. So he's huge. Kesef Mishnah says, what's the reason? Since the verse is not conclusive, all are engraved. Being that the verse is not conclusive, and if something's not conclusive, that means we have a doubt, as we explained before earlier in detail, that in verse 34, we're not sure with that bolded word engraved. Does it refer to the goblets or to the knobs and the flowers? We go both ways. We go back, we go front. And therefore, everything becomes engraved. That's how Kesef Mishnah explains Rambam. Seems good. Says the Rebbe, and he's mirroring the question of the Maggid Mishnah, another very important commentary. Are you kidding? Because we have a doubt, we engrave all 7 branches. The doubt of where that word engrave applies, if it's before or after, is only in verse 34, which is the discussion of the middle branch, not on verse 33. On verse 33, as we explained earlier, it's quite obvious, it's clear, and it's evident, it's not vague at all, that the mishukadim, the engraving, refers to the goblets, as explained earlier. Look how the verse reads. So why are we applying this engraving on all 7 branches, on everything? It doesn't make any sense. This is a question that's asked by the Maggid Mishnah, one of the classic commentaries, and it bothers the Rebbe because commentaries try to answer his question. It's a very strong question. Rambam rules that they did it on all 7 branches and on everything, not just the goblets, but the knobs and the flowers. What's the logic? So the Kesef Mishnah told us the logic is because the verse is ambiguous and not conclusive. Which verse is ambiguous and not conclusive? 34, not 33. 33 is very conclusive. So why are we applying this application across the board on all 7 branches? The middle branch is where it's ambiguous. And the middle branch, if we have a doubt, I guess Rambam should rule that we should do it on everything, on the middle branch, the goblets and the other stuff. But in 33, the other 6 branches, we should do what it says in the verse, quite explicitly, that this engraving, this special fancy engraving work should only apply to the goblets and not to the flowers and to the knobs. So this is a strong question. This is interesting in the Sicha because the Rebbe's main question of the Sicha is really the question of the Kesef Mishnah. But he carries that question because commentaries try to answer it. Apparently, there are a number of commentaries. The Rebbe discusses 2 of them trying to answer. These are Achronim, later day commentaries, but the Rebbe doesn't like either one of those commentaries. He doesn't accept it, and the Rebbe is going to give his own very novel answer. So let's read the Rebbe's question at the bottom of the screen. As asked by Maggid Mishnah, the doubt is only in verse 34 regarding the center branch. Why are we engraving the knobs and flowers of all the branches? The other branches are in 33. There is no doubt of what the word Mishukadim, engraved, refers to in that verse. So this is a very strong question. It's a very strong question. It's like, duh, you know what I mean? There's one verse that's in doubt in this section. Says Rambam, everything should be. It's like the guy walks into the bar and says, drinks for everybody. Like, why? Why are we doing it on both verses? When there isn't a doubt on both verses. There's a doubt only about the middle branch. You should do it all over the middle branch. It's a big problem. And this is halacha, this is Rambam, the authority on Jewish law. Hello? Why would he do this? Why is suddenly painting with such a broad brush? So, the first answer that we're going to give is from a commentary called the Mabit. I mean, these are respected commentaries, but they're latter-day commentaries. The Rebbe can hold his own with them and say that he disagrees. You're not going to find the Rebbe disagreeing with the Rambam or with Rashi. But the later-day commentaries, sometimes the Rebbe questions and says, yeah, I see it differently, and that's okay. The Mabit says, and he's basing it on one of the earlier commentaries, but basically this is his approach. That when the Talmud says the verse is not conclusive, it doesn't mean that verse 34 is not conclusive, the way we've been explaining it until now. It means, furthermore, verse 33 and 34 are in conflict. That's why it's not conclusive. Since verse 34, this is how he explains this statement. The Talmud says that there's something not conclusive about the verse. He says, you know what it means? It's not conclusive. The following, here's what the non-conclusive. Till now, we've been learning what's not conclusive. Verse 34, that word engraved, where does it flow? It's squarely on verse 34. He says, no. When we say the verse is not conclusive, we're talking about there's a contradiction between 34 and 35. That's how we read it. Why is it a contradiction? Because in 34, when it speaks about the 6 branches, it indicates clearly that the engraving is only on the goblets. It's right there in the verse. 3 goblets should be engraved on each branch. It doesn't refer to a knob and a flower, that comes later. So 33 is clearly about the goblets on the 6 branches. 34 is pretty clear, not conclusively clear, but pretty clear that it refers to the knobs and the flowers. The reason why, he says, because if you look at the musical note and under the word goblets, it's esnachta. Esnachta is like a soft stop. It's a musical note in the middle of a verse, which is a soft stop. And therefore, so the sing-song would be on the menorah's center branch, 4 goblets, soft stop. And then it says engraved, its knobs and its flowers. So based on that, it's not evident completely, but it's more likely that this word engraved is a reference to the knob and the flowers. Hence, we have a conflict. 33, it's saying that the engraving should apply to the goblets, because that's what it says. That's very conclusive. And 34, it seems to be saying that the engraving applies to the knobs and the flowers based on the musical note. So we have a conflict. Which one is it? Is it knobs and flowers, or is it goblets? And therefore, because there's a conflict, we don't want to take any chances. Because if the Torah wants it to be engraved in this fancy way, that's a requirement. Whereas if we do it in a case where it's not required, nothing is lost. We made it a little nicer. And therefore, we do it all. That's the answer of the Mabit. But if this answer bothers you, you're in good company, because the Rebbe doesn't like it either. The Rebbe uses the language in his original talk, b'mechilat kvod Torato, with all due respect for his great Torah knowledge. Apparently, he was a very respected commentator. But the Rebbe says, you're telling me that 33 and 34 are in conflict, and that's why we decide that all of them should be the same? Why? 33 is conclusively one way. Leave it be. Why should we decide that because the middle branch is one way, that the other 6 should be the same way? Where'd you get that from? These 2 verses are not in conflict because they're not talking about the same thing. One is talking about the middle branch, and the other one's talking about the 6 other branches. They could be in conflict. That's not a contradiction. You're talking about 2 different subjects. Why should you have to equal them out? The Mabit says that, because they're in conflict and the 6 are going to be like this, the middle is going to be like that. That's not nice. Probably the Torah wants them all to be the same, but they're not, because the Torah is saying, speaking out of 2 sides of its mouth. So therefore, let's make everything. Where do you get that idea from? Who has the authority to do that and decide where the Torah clearly seems to indicate? In verse 33, it's talking about the 6 branches, and it indicates that it's about the goblets. And in 34, it's talking about the middle branch. And it's indicating, leaning more that it's about the knobs and the flowers. But you could say that 34 is ambiguous, as the Talmud does say. But why should you mix in 33 into the ambiguity of 34? 34 is ambiguous. 33 is crystal clear. So when it comes to 33, the verse which speaks about the 6 branches, it's crystal clear. You should have the engraving element, the engraving fanciness, only on the knobs, only on the goblets. Whereas the center branch, 34, which is ambiguous, you're not sure what it goes. On the middle one, you should do it on everything. Why would you spread the wealth? Why would you paint everything with one brush? Why would you consider them in conflict when they're talking about different parts of the menorah? Plus, the Rebbe is bothered a lot by the fact that the Mabit wants to indicate that when the Talmud says that the verse here is ambiguous, it means a conflict between 2 verses. That's not what it says. And we find it explicitly in many places in the Talmud and in the Medrash, explicit, that the ambiguity is in verse 34. There's no mention about an ambiguity in 33 or a conflict, and the ambiguity arises from the fact that 34 conflicts with 33. This is new. This is novel. This is not what it says in the Talmud or the Medrash or any of these sources. The classic sources indicate where is the ambiguity. It's one of the 5 verses. And one of those 5 is verse 34 in Exodus. Thank you very much. 33 is not part of the ambiguity at all. So the whole thing bothers the Rebbe. Let's take a look. I put it on the screen for clarity. Let's go from left to right. The Rebbe's question. The doubt is only in verse 34 regarding the center branch. Why engrave the knobs and flowers on all branches? So answer number 1 from the Mabit. You like my light bulbs? My light bulbs? I want to thank Basia, our designer, for coming up with these designs. Answer number 1 from the Mabit. Verse is not conclusive. When the Talmud says that statement, it means the 2 verses contradict. That verse 33 about the 6 branches indicates the engraving of the goblets. Verse 34 about the center branch indicates about engraving the knobs and the flowers because of the musical note thing. or at least indicates that more so. So since the two verses contradict, that means that's the ambiguity, that's the non-conclusiveness. And therefore we engrave them all, says the Rabbi in his rejection. I don't understand what you're talking about. 33, the 6 branches is explicitly goblets. There is no ambiguity. There's nothing inconclusive about 33. So why are you making 33 something inconclusive, and you're making it part of the doubt, and you're throwing it up and making everybody the same? Plus, the Talmud and the Medrash is very important. The Talmud and the Medrash are very clear in a few places, Jerusalem Talmud and the Mechilta Medrash, etc., that the verse is not conclusive, unquote, is a reference to verse 34 alone. So, Mabit, with all due respect, you can't argue with that. These are classic sources, the Talmud and the Medrash. This is classic oral Torah. Yeah, it's inconclusive. Which verse? 34. It's not inconclusive because it's in conflict with 33, making them both inconclusive. That's very creative. Where do you get that from? So the Rebbe's back to his question. Why does Rambam have us engrave in this fancy way everything? The Rebbe quotes another one of the commentaries, Kiryas Sefer, and others, a few of the commentaries, who give answer number 2. And what do they say? I'm reading. Logically, all ornaments should be identically designed. He gives a much less aggressive answer than the Mabit. He says, you're right, that the non-conclusive verse is 34, not 33. But since in 34 it's non-conclusive, we don't know which way to read it, so we have to read it both ways. So in the middle branch, we're going to engrave everything. It's not so logical that the other 6 should be different than the middle. Let's make it all the same. It should be symmetrical. Says the Rebbe rejects this too. Such innovation, I'm reading the Rebbe's rejection, such innovation requires a source. I mean, it's okay to say that they could do it, but to say that is the law, Rambam rules it. He doesn't say it's a nice suggestion. He rules it. All of them have to be that way. Why? Just because the decorator decided that symmetrical is nice? Maybe asymmetrical is nice. I don't know. You have to have a source for this before you put it in the code of Jewish law. This is not the code of Jewish graphic interior decorating. This is the code of Jewish law. How do you decide that should all be the same? Where's this rule of symmetry? So this doesn't really stand. Plus, this is a very important add-on. At a minimum, I'm reading, the Rebbe's rejection on the right side of your screen. At a minimum, Rambam would write, quote, it seems to me. If you're a student of Rambam, as many Chabadniks are, we all study Rambam over the course of 3 chapters a day or 1 chapter a day. Or the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Rebbe made Rambam very much part of our lives. The Rambam will often say, V'yireli, v'yirali, it seems to me, where he is giving his opinion, even though it doesn't say so in the sources. Rambam is a big boy. He knows enough that he could sometimes say, I suggest that this is how it should be done, even though it doesn't say so explicitly. So if that's where Rambam source, why does the Rambam rule that everything should be symmetrical, everything should be fancy with this engraving style? Even though it doesn't say it about everything. It only says it, as we said before, by some of it. But since we don't know, so we have to do by everything in the middle, let's be symmetrical about everything. The Rambam would say, at a minimum, it seems to me, it's nice, even everything out. Don't make a little bit engraving. The middle one is all engraved, the cup, the goblets, and the flowers and knobs. The other 6, only the goblets are engraved and not the others. Remember, again, engraving means like an almond, this fancy look, this fancy craftsmanship. Make it across the board. Even it out. Make it symmetrical. The Rambam should have at least said, it seems to me that would be the right thing to do. He doesn't say that. He simply says, everything should be done this way. It's a ruling. Big problem. So let's go back. This is the Rambam, and this is based on that verse. How do we understand it? Okay, so we're left with the question. We're back to the question. going to give a very novel explanation. Let's just catch us up because that was a little bit foresty for the trees. Let's go back to the trees. What we learned is that there's 5 verses in the Torah that are inconclusive. That there's a word that we don't know which way to read it. And that's how it remains. One of those verses is regarding the menorah. And then regarding the menorah being engraved in a special fancy almond-like way. We don't know if that refers to the first half of the verse, which is referring to the goblets of the center branch, or the knobs and flowers, which is on the center branch. We don't know. And therefore, we have to do both. Rambam rules, not only we do both on the center branch, we do both on all 7 branches. Says the Rebbe, and the other commentaries ask this question, why? Why the other 6 branches are getting this ruling that everything should be symmetrically done with this in fancy engraving? Regarding the other 6 branches, the Torah is not quiet about it. There's a verse, 1 verse prior, which clearly states that over there it should be engraved in this fancy almond-like way regarding the goblets. Over there, it's not ambiguous at all. It's conclusive. So do it with the goblets for the other 6, not with the knobs and the flowers. The middle branch, which is the one that's ambiguous, you don't know if it's goblets only or if it's flowers and knobs only. The middle one, do them everything. Where does Rambam get this ruling that everything should be made in all 7 branches? The commentaries take a stab at it. The Mabit says that, I'm just recapping, that the inconclusivity of the verse is not the verse 34 itself, but the contradiction between 33 and 34, and therefore we even them all out. Says the Rebbe, that needs a source. And in fact, the sources say the opposite. The sources say that the only ambiguity is 34. This is Talmudic sources, classic sources. So the Rebbe doesn't accept that. But you see, this is a very strong question that the Mabit is trying to find an answer, like at all costs. It's a very strong question. It's a Rambam ruling. And then the other commentary suggests that, just the concept of symmetry. Since we know that the middle branch is inconclusive, verse 34, so we have to do it on everything, the goblets and the flowers and the knobs. Then we have another 6 branches. It's not going to be symmetrical if on those, this fancy design is only on the goblets and not on the other stuff. Let's do it across the board. It's nice, but where do you get such a source that everything in the temple has to be symmetrical? At a minimum, if this is just Rambam's opinion, or it's Rambam's design taste, or Rambam's suggestion that that's what would be considered nice, he should have said, you know what, it appears to me there's nothing lost by adding. You can't subtract the Torah's instruction, but there's nothing wrong by making everything. He doesn't say that. He says it as a rule. In the Hebrew, Hakol Meshukadim, they're all done in this fancy way. Why? What's the source? So the Rebbe is going to come up with a novel approach. It's like completely out of the box. Here's what the Rebbe is going to do. Let me tell you what he does, and then we'll go through it together on the screen. The Rebbe is essentially going to say, I'm going to give you a bird's eye view of the rest of the Sicha, and then we'll study it together. That there's no way that the Torah really left it ambiguous, and that we don't really know how it's supposed to be. Because when did that doubt creep in? How could, first of all, God give us a rule in the Torah that we don't know what to do about? That's the first problem. God gives us a rule we don't know what to do about, so what did Moses do? The other 4 verses that are ambiguous, they're not practical questions. They're just theoretical. They're narratives. They're stories. It's interesting to study what the verse means. It's a literary problem, but it's not a legal problem. This is the only verse that's a legal problem. How could God give an instruction about the design of the menorah and he left it ambiguous? Just for clarity, let's take a quick look at the other verses, and you'll see what I'm saying. You have over here 5 verses that are not conclusive, right? The other 4 are just narratives. Like how we translate the word will stand is not relevant for Jewish law. The Torah is saying we don't know what it means. Does it mean that will stand means he'll be forgiven or it won't be forgiven if he didn't? This is not relevant to us. It's a story about Cain. You know, the curse of Jacob to Joseph, the rebuke to Shimon and Levi. Who was he cursing? Was he cursing the ox or cursing the anger? All right. It's a literary question. It's a scholarship question. It's not a legal question. The same thing is with the others. When he should go fight with Amalek or go on the mountain. I mean, this happened 3,500 years ago. Moses will lie down and then he'll rise up. Again, it's important because it's Torah study, but it's not a question of legality. It wasn't a to-do. It wasn't an instruction. Whereas the verse on top of the screen, our verse, the menorahs should be made with goblets and they should be engraved the flowers and the knobs. What does that word engraved mean? Does it mean the flowers and the knobs or the goblets? How could God speak from both sides of his mouth? What did Moses do? What did Moses do? And the question is further. Let's assume God told Moses a certain way because Moses had to build it. He couldn't just do it ambiguous. And then for some reason, later on, the question arose, hey, what did God mean? At what point in time did there come that confusion? Let's assume, I don't know, at a certain point in time, the confusion began. They should look what the menorah looked like 50 years before. You can't have an ambiguity about a practicality, and you can't have a doubt about something that was public for 830 years in the two temples. It was standing right in the public. So how could there be an ambiguity? This is the Rebbe's question, and the Rebbe sidebars into the concept that in other areas in Jewish law, where there are questions that are about debate, for example, there's two opinions on how the tefillin should be, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. How could there be two opinions? Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam were arguing. This is about 800 years ago. You should open up the tefillin of Rashi's grandfather and see what it looks like. At what point did you have a doubt? There never was a generation where Jews didn't do tefillin. So anytime you're having an argument about something factual in law, something that everybody knew about, it's very strange. And the Rebbe gives numerous examples, which we're going to cover. But back to our case, how could this be that the law was given in an ambiguous fashion? And at what point did it become a doubt? And the Rebbe is therefore going to conclude the law was clearly not given ambiguously. Clearly, God told Moses what to do. In fact, Moses was shown an image. And what would he tell him to do? Everything should be decorated. The question is not a legal one, it's a literary one, just like the other four verses. Legally, what was told? To do everything. Even if on a literary level it refers to one or the other. But there's a principle in Torah that sometimes we learn from one to the others. This is a little bit like the second answer that was given, that it's logical that things should be symmetrical. But the second answer that was given didn't give any source. It's just a guess. The Rebbe is saying that logic is not just logical, but it's absolute. It's impossible that the Torah was given and the law was given and we didn't know what to do. Clearly, they did it on both. And that's why Rambam rules that everything was done that way. And not only everything in the middle branch, but all 7 branches, because there's a concept of symmetry, because symmetry is beautiful. We're talking about a craftsmanship. It doesn't make sense for the same craftsmanship, for different craftsmanship levels to be on the same piece. If you're using the highest level craftsmanship, then it's throughout. And clearly that's what was done at the beginning of time. The question only arose, how should the verse be read? It's a literary question. And therefore Rambam rules, I want you to know everything was like that. Because everything, when the Torah says to make it beautiful, you make it all beautiful, of course. And the proof is a logical proof. It's impossible that there was a doubt about this. Because at what point did that doubt begin? This is how the Rebbe answers it. Let's take a look. Let's walk through this now, what we just learned. Let's walk it through here. Let me go to the right slide. Oops. This is the final slide of the Sicha. The Rebbe's preface to his explanation on top of the screen. How can a verse be inconclusive in practical instruction? Right? We already discussed this. I showed you the 5 verses which the Talmud says are inconclusive. All the other 4 are not practical. It's just a literary question. But this verse seems to be practical. Which part should be engraved, this or that? How could there be an inconclusive statement? Torah didn't give clear instructions, so what did Moses do? And a continuation of that question is, how can there be doubt in a factual issue? The menorah was publicly seen for 800 years. An extension of that question is, how and when did the doubt arise? At what point in time? Talmud says this is a statement in the Talmud, post-temple. I want you to know that this verse is inconclusive. We don't know. Really? Who don't know? And in the Sicha, the Rebbe goes through the pains. In the time of the first temple, they didn't know. Why didn't they just take a look? I mean, they were sitting on a menorah that was built, in the first temple for 830 years. It was in the full eye view of people. It was in a part of the temple that even a non-Kohen is allowed to go if he's in a state of purity. People saw it. So let's assume by the first temple, the 410 years of the first temple, it can't be that it was a doubt, because you want to know what it looks like? Look at it. You want to look at it? Look what Moses did. Then you want to say maybe in the second temple, since there was a 70-year exile, the Jews came back, and we know in the second exile, they came back, the second Commonwealth with Ezra, things were forgotten. There's an example of that the second temple, they didn't know where the dividing wall was between the Holy of Holies and the Heichal, the section which is just plain holy. And there's a dividing wall in the temple. And that dividing wall has the thickness of an amma, of a biblical measure called an amma, a cubit, 1.5 feet. And there's a question mark. Was that amma, that 1.5 cubits, that cubit, on the space, on the square footage of the Holy of Holies, or on the square footage of the other area? And because they didn't know in the second temple, they made an area in between. So there was a change. But this is a known fact in the Talmud and etc. That the second temple, they didn't know that information. Nowhere does it say about the menorah that everything should be engraved in the second temple, because the first temple, we don't know what they did. There's no such concept. It's not brought down anywhere. And it follows that the menorah is different than that wall placement. The wall placement, you have to come with a measuring tape. The Kohanes were probably not walking around with measuring tapes. So it's conceivable that after a 70-year exile, they came back and they weren't sure. The builders that built it were probably long gone. And I don't know if they had the plans or whatever. And they didn't know, so for precautionary reasons, they added an extra cubit in between the two spaces, not to encroach on the wrong space. It's conceivable that such a thing should be forgotten. But you're telling me that in the second temple, the menorah that stood for 410 years in the full eye view of any pure Jew, not even a Kohen. Plus, it's clear from the words of the Tanakh that there were Kohens that survived the 70 years and came back to serve in the second temple. There were Kohens that were blessed with long life, and they served in the end of the first temple and at the beginning of the second temple. They were Kohens. Clearly, they knew what the menorah looked like. So why would that be a doubt? 2 reasons why it can't be that the doubt cropped up in the second temple. First of all, it would have said so somewhere that this ruling of the Rambam, namely that everything should be engraved, is only applicable to the second temple, because we don't know what really happened. It doesn't say that anywhere. It sounds like this is across the board. Plus, it's not logical that there was a doubt even in the second temple, because hundreds of years it was in the public view, and some of those people had traditions, some of those people were even alive. And the Rebbe says, maybe you want to entertain that really there was no doubt in the first temple. We don't know what it was, but it was a certain way for 410 years. And then in the second temple, for another 420 years, it was no doubt. It was in a certain way too. We don't know. But now the Talmud says we in the Talmud don't know. This statement that the verse is ambiguous is a Talmudic statement written, I don't know, a couple hundred years after the destruction of the temple, maybe 100 years, not so long, maybe even decades. It's a Tana. It's a Mishnaic scholar. It seems that the Rebbe wants to indicate that he didn't live too much after the destruction. And at that time, it was already forgotten. So the Rebbe says, if that's the case, why is Rambam making a ruling that everything should be engraved? What's that ruling? That ruling is based on the fact that the verse is inconclusive. When is the verse becoming conclusive? Now, after the destruction of both temples. So what's Rambam's ruling for Mashiach's times? The Rambam wrote his book. He's writing how the temple was built. So you're telling me no. The rules of the building of the temple, Rambam is writing how it was built, the first and second temple. That's the rulings. Some of it applies to the third temple too. But you're telling me this whole ruling that everything should be done engraved because we don't know what it was is only applicable to the third temple? I mean, Rambam should have said such a thing. He indicates that that's how it was. Plus, when the third temple comes, there won't be any ambiguity because Moses will come and Aaron, and they'll say exactly how God showed him on the mountain. So the whole thing doesn't make any sense. Remember, it's not just even, and Moses was even shown it. So clearly that's what he made. So the whole thing is a problem. When did the doubt arise? How could there be any doubt about a factual thing? And a factual thing that's public. You see, there's a lot of disputes in Jewish law and the Talmud and nuances, but you can't have disputes about things that everybody does. When did the doubt arise? The Rebbe gives a few examples. I'm taking some examples not only that appear in this Sicha and the footnotes, but also in the unedited version of this talk. The Rebbe says, take, for example, we're in now in the shaded box in the middle of the screen. Take, for example, similar questions about how, when did doubt arise? This is what makes this Sicha special, that the Rebbe is tackling a big picture question in Judaism. So take, for example, the debate between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam about tefillin. They both agree that it's the same 4 portions that go into the tefillin. The question is the order. In the headpiece is 4 boxes. What's the order of the tefillin? It's a nuanced difference, but it's a difference. The same thing is in the arm tefillin. What's the order of the 4 portions? In the arm, it's on one scroll. It makes no difference. How could you have such a debate? As we said earlier, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, they're only 800 years ago or so. They're arguing about how the tefillin look. Judaism has been around for 2,000 years before that. They should find out what their Zaydis tefillin look like, and that was it. Suddenly we're disagreeing because we don't know what they forgot the tradition of 2,000 plus years. Just 800 years ago, they couldn't figure out how tefillin look. It doesn't make any sense. At what point was it forgotten? You see, there was never a break. There was never a generation of Jews that didn't have tefillin. Everybody knew what the tefillin looked like, and that's what they did. They did what their father did and what their grandfather did, and they kept doing it. You know, an example that comes to mind is the esrog. The Torah says, take a beautiful fruit. It doesn't say what kind of fruit. We only know from tradition because Moses showed them the esrog. We don't have a question. Nobody comes up and says, maybe it should be peaches. I think it should be peaches. It'd be a lot cheaper. We know exactly what kind of fruit. I don't care. There's not a doubt, even though the text is very ambiguous. The text says a nice fruit. You don't need text for something that happens every year after year after year without any break. There's never a year when there's no esrogs. So how could you have a doubt about it? Similarly, there's never a generation with no tefillin. How could you doubt if it's Rashi's way or a bit of Talmud? Strong question. You know that with another debate in the Talmud between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the 2 schools, about the tzitzis. Interestingly enough, we know that tzitzis have 8 strings, but really it's 4 strings folded. That's the opinion of Beis Shammai, the house of Shammai. The house of Hillel says you only need 3 strings folded. For whatever reason. How could you have a debate about that? Shammai and Hillel, they're earlier than Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, so they're not 800 years ago. They are, 1,600 years ago, 1,700 years ago. What? Judaism existed for 2,000 years before them. They're arguing about the tzitzis. They had teachers. The famous Shemai and Avtalia. They should have looked at their talos. I mean, when did this doubt arise? And this is a debate. And they came up with a ruling, and everybody follows the ruling. The Rabbi gives some other examples. The shofar. This is not in the edited version of the Sicha, but this is in the original Sicha. I'm including because I think it's interesting. You know, when we blow the shofar Rosh Hashanah, we have the long sounds, tekiah, and then we have the two short sounds, shvarim, which is the three sounds, three medium sounds, and teruah, which is the 9 very short sounds. And most people don't do 9, they do a lot more. It doesn't matter. Those are the three sounds. We have the tekiah, the long sound, the shvarim, the 3 medium sounds, and then the teruah, the 9 very short sounds. And if you pay attention in shul, you know that when they blow the shofar, they do a full set of, the Torah says you should blow tekiah before and after, and in the middle should be teruah. But the teruah is done in 3 different ways. It's done with the 9 short, it's done with the 3 medium, and it's done with both. And we end up with 30 sounds because we have to do 10 of each. It's done with both. And this is brought in the code of Jewish law, and that's the law. Why do we have to sit in shul and blow tekiah, shvarim, teruah, and then tekiah? We do that 3 times. And then we do tekiah, shvarim, and then tekiah. And then we do that 3 times. And then we do tekiah, teruah, tekiah. We do that 3 times. Like, which one is it? In the Torah, it doesn't say these 3 combinations. It only says 1 combination in the Torah. You should have tekiah sandwiching on both sides, a teruah. Says the Code of Jewish Law from the Talmud that there's a confusion what the word teruah means. Biblically, there's only 2 sounds. There's tekiahs on both sides sandwiching something called a teruah. What is a teruah? Aha! Say the classic sources, since we don't know what a teruah is, over the generation became a doubt. Is a teruah 3 short ones? Or is it 9 tiny ones? Or is it a combination of both? We do all of the above. And on each of them, we sandwich with the tekiah, so we have 3 different sandwiches, multiplied up by 3 sandwiches. We got 9 sandwiches. Says the Rebbe, really? At what point did they not know what a teruah looks like? Moses was told, do a teruah. He did a teruah. Whatever he did, that's what Joshua did, and that's what Samuel did. That's what King David did. But at what point did they say, hey, what does a teruah look like? We don't know. Is there nobody alive today? What was here last Rosh Hashanah? There's never a year when there was no shofar. This is we call this in Yiddish, a balabatish shayla. It's a very practical, basic question. How do you understand that? I must tell you, these things bothered me over the years, but I never thought to ask them because I didn't think there was an answer. How could there be Rashi tefillin and Rabbeinu Tam tefillin? What did Moses wear? What did King David wear? What did Shammai and Hillel wear? 1,000 years pre-Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam. Suddenly we're having a confusion. How could it be? We don't know what a teruah is. Everybody had amnesia and forgot what we did 1 year ago? The whole Jewish nation? It makes no sense. The Rebbe even mentions in his unedited talk the concept that we have Sephardic and Ashkenazic customs. And some of them are very strong, serious customs. The most famous one is rice on Pesach or not rice on Pesach. It's a very big deal. Parenthetically, I saw recently when Rabbi J.J. Hecht brought the Sephardic boys and girls from Iran in 1979 when the Shah was overthrown. It's relevant. It's timely now in the times that we're living in. So the Rebbe instructed, of course, they took care of them and they adorned them and everything else. They fed them and they made seders for them. The Rebbe instructed they should serve them rice. I didn't know that until recently. In Ashkenaz world, nobody eats rice on Pesach. It's not that it's considered to be leavened, but that's the halacha because it's so similar. It's like we don't eat chicken and meat. We don't eat chicken and milk because it's similar to meat and milk. No Ashkenazi home is having rice on Pesach. Never going to happen. The Rebbe instructed Rabbi Hecht's people that the kitchen should be set up for the Sephardic boys and girls. They should get their rice. That's what they're used to, and that's their custom. So it's clearly bona fide. How could there be 2 bona fide customs? What did Moses do? Did he eat rice or did he not eat rice? And at what point? Remember, this is something that happens every single year. This is a little bit less of a question because Sephardim and Ashkenazim were scattered and there were 1,000 years when they didn't see each other. So maybe, but the Rebbe mentions this in his unedited talk that it's still curious. So the Rebbe says the explanation is going to be, let's first talk about these other doubts. The tefillin, the tzitzis, and the shofar. And then we'll apply it to our case. with the menorah's engraving. The Rebbe says it's clear that, let's use the tefillin as an example. We have two types of tefillin, Rashi and Rabbi Tam. They're very similar. It's the same 4 portions, just a question of how they're ordered in the box. Says the Rebbe, it's obvious, and the Rebbe bases this on other commentaries. It's not all his novelty. It's obvious that both ways were bona fide at the beginning. It's obvious that both ways were kosher. Moses gave a general principle. He didn't nail down exactly that detail because it didn't matter. You have the 4 portions, close enough for government work. It's a little bit like this, a little bit like that. It didn't matter. Both are bona fide. There's different arguments for one order versus the other. There's a plus and minus. Both are bona fide Torah approaches. And clearly says the Rabbi at the beginning of Jewish history, both were done by different Jews. People followed their Rabbi. It's possible even that Joshua did it different than Moses because both are based on the principles of Torah rule, and the way it was presented from heaven was in a generality. There are certain areas of Judaism where the generality is presented, and the details aren't that important. Usually the details are, but in these cases, the details aren't important enough. It didn't matter. Both are bona fide. Did all that with the tzitzis, did all that with the 2 sounds of the shofar. And therefore, it's conceivable for many generations, for hundreds of years, perhaps. There were people who did this tefillin, people did that tefillin. And both were putting kosher tefillin. There were people who did Shammai tzitzis and Hillel tzitzis. There were shuls and communities where they blew the Teruma one way or the other way or the third way. And it was kosher. Just like there's people who eat rice and don't eat rice, and it's kosher. That's your custom. There is room in Judaism, and certain laws were clearly given. The language of the Rebbe is in a general way, and the details were applicable in 2 ways or 3 ways in the shofar case, and all were bona fide. There came a time when the sages said, let's make one unified custom, and that's what they said, you know what, for example, in the shofar, let's do it in a way that covers all the bases, and every shul should do the same thing, because there's a value to that. And there's probably tremendous wisdom in that. The sages knew that there's a long exile ahead. Jews are going to be scattered everywhere. And if we have 3 different customs, there's going to be confusion, etc. Because there's no longer a central court and a Supreme Court, Sanhedrin, etc. And therefore they said, if they did it, they knew what they were doing. They had a reason. But they weren't consolidating the 3 customs because only one is right and we don't know which one. They were all right. But it's time to figure it out. Did all that with the tefillin. Did all that with the tzitzis. The Rebbe brings sources in the Talmud that there were certain rules that the Shammai and Hillel camps disagreed. And before the ruling was put down like Hillel, in most instances, Hillel wins the arguments for whatever reason. The Shammai people would behave differently. They would behave according to their custom. And nevertheless, the Hillel people would intermarry to the Shammai people. Even though according to their view, you might say they're not observing Judaism. Let's use the tzitzis. They're not wearing tzitzis. The tzitzis are not kosher, which would be a big problem. No, they accepted that this was kosher. It was just another fashion until the ruling was set down that we rule like Beis Hillel. You got to follow Hillel. Incidentally, the tzitzis case looks like we follow Shammai because we have 4 strings folded over. But the concept, based on this, we can answer so many principles and so many different laws in Torah which are factual and historic and never missed a generation. And yet there's 2 different opinions. I can't resist pointing out with the esrog. There's a Chabad custom to use an Italian esrog. Many Jews don't have that custom. Which one is right? Clearly, both are bona fide. We have a reason for that tradition. The Medrash says that Moses, the first year, sent messengers on a cloud to go to Italy and bring esrogs. And clearly the Rebbes of Chabad had a special meaning in that. That was the first year, whatever. But nobody's arguing that the other esrog is not kosher. Chas v'shalom, God forbid. So here you have an example of 2 traditions. They were both acceptable. They're both under the umbrella of esrog. The same thing as the tefillin. They're both under the umbrella. Rashi and Rabbi Tam were just putting their names once it was decided, let's solidify and let's consolidate it. They each held that it should be consolidated in a certain fashion. The ruling was accepted like Rashi. Incidentally, in that case, both are bona fide to the extent that halacha, Jewish law, states that if you want to be God-fearing, you should also wear a Rabbeinu Tam after the prayer. And the Rebbe quotes it from Tikkun Zohar, one of the great Kabbalistic sources, that other set of tefillin, as we get closer to Mashiach, because it's Kabbalistically very strong, should also be worn, which today is becoming a very widespread custom, albeit in the understanding that Rashi tefillin is the ruling. But it's not that Rashi's tefillin is the ruling, that Rashi is kosher, Rabbeinu Tam is not kosher. They were both kosher for hundreds of years. Some people did this, some people did that. They're close enough. They both went under the heading of kosher tefillin. It's only once the ruling came down, like Rashi, that it's no longer acceptable to wear a Rabbeinu Tam, which is why people don't make, as your main tefillin, which is why people don't make a blessing on a Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, because the halacha is now like Rashi. But we still wear the second tefillin in many circles, and the Rebbe was very big about it, based on the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which traces back to the Kabbalah, to the Tikkun Zohar. The close to Mashiach, the Code of Jewish Law simply says if you're God-fearing, you should wear it, which is curious. It further plays into the Rebbe's theory in the Sicha. Normally, if there's two opinions in Jewish law, you fight it out, and then there's a ruling. You don't do the minority opinion, just in case. There's no such thing. When it comes to tefillin, we do it. Again, because it has Kabbalistic value, whatever the reason is. But in the context of this Sicha, it's a bona fide form of tefillin, albeit not the final word when it comes to Jewish law, after the law was consolidated by the sages over the generations. So once you have that concept, that's explained in the middle box on your screen, the things are presented in a general way, and they can have two meanings, and both are like bona fide. We're just not sure which one is the one to go by. Apply that to our verse. The verse says the menorah had goblets that are engraved, and its knobs and flowers. What is the engraved applied to? Well, it's ambiguous. Says the Rabbi, it meant both. We can argue which one it means on a literary level. But on a legal level, it's both. There never could have been a time when we didn't know what to do. You can't give us a law that no one knows what to do. What was standing in the temple for 830 years, for crying out loud? We know what it looked like. The Torah chose to write it ambiguously for whatever reasons known to God. Just like the tefillin were given in an ambiguous state with two options until it was consolidated hundreds and hundreds of years later, maybe thousands of years later. But in concept, they're both correct. Both interpretations of the verse are appropriate because the verse was written in an ambiguous fashion. Are the goblets engraved? Or the flowers and knobs engraved? Guess what they did? They did both, because both were kosher. And that was what the message was on a legal level. The only Talmudic question is, on a literary level, what is the proper meaning of the verse? Which then makes this verse equal to all the other four verses. Remember? All the other five verses, they're all just ambiguous on a literary level. None of them are not conclusive on a halachic legal level. You can't have a non-conclusive verse on a legal level. How could God give instructions is not conclusive? But now we're saying even the verse on top of the screen, the one that we're dealing with today and by the menorah, it's also not conclusive on a literary level, on a practical level. They did both. How does Rambam say everything was done in that way? He knew it. He knew it. Rabbi says he probably had a brisa, a Talmudic source, but he knew it also from logic. It's clearly that this can be ambiguous in practicality. There's no way to have two possibilities in the law. It was either this or that, and there's never a time when the doubt could creep up because there was never a break in time when the menorah wasn't in public for over 800 years. Says Rambam, I'm telling you, it was all done, not just in the middle branch, and all of them. And the logic in that is, let's go to the end. Let me just share the thought, and then we'll show it on the screen. It's a few pieces. The first piece is that the verse about the menorah is just like the Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam thing. It was given in a big way, which can go either way. Both are correct. The Talmud says it's ambiguous. Point number two. It's ambiguous on a literary level. Which way does the verse mean literary, but not legally? Just like the other four verses. That's an interesting discussion. Let's discuss it like this. Does it mean like that? There's a soft spot. There's no soft stop. It's a literary question. It's not a legal question. Point 3, being that this is a design element, you see, but it's a design element that involves craftsmanship. If Hashem tells me the menorah should have certain designs, I can't decide to add my own designs on my own. But in this case, it's not about a design. Like, for example, there's goblets and there's flowers and there's knobs. So we could say we want to make it nicer. We're also going to put, peaches. You can't do that. You can't add design. But if it's a craftsmanship element, the Rambam is very clear in his other book on the Mishnah that the word mishukadim, engraved, is not another element of design. It's rather a craftsmanship level. When you're crafting, when the Torah says to craft the vessel on a certain level of craftsmanship, it's clearly across the board. I gave an example before that the silver should be 925. No one's going to say to make the same Kiddush cup, the top is 925 and the bottom is a lesser number, a less pure silver. That doesn't make sense. Craftsmanship is craftsmanship. I think it doesn't make sense. I'm not familiar with silver, but that's my guess. Craftsmanship is across the board. If it's done in a mishukadim style level craftsmanship, it's logical that it should be across everything. The Torah only explicitly says it about one. Which one? We don't know. We may never know. We don't have to know. We can debate it. But that's a literary question. But because of that debate, the Torah is clearly indicating that it's both. And not just both, but all 7 branches, because it's a craftsmanship. The whole menorah is one craftsmanship. It should be done on that level. Alternatively, a fourth point is that even if it's not a legal principle that all of the 7 have to be, but let's assume only the middle one had to be engraved on everything. But there's a principle of beautifying a mitzvah. And being that there's a craftsmanship, is an extra beauty on that level, it makes sense that it should all be crafted in the same way. Let's put it up on the screen. So let's go at the bottom of the screen, Rabbi's explanation from left to right. The menorah's verse is taught in a general manner, therefore applies practically to both. Similar to all the examples we gave earlier with the tefillin, etc. The verse is inconclusive, is a quote, which means it's not in a legal sense, it's in a literary sense. In a legal sense, they did both. Furthermore, the next point, engraved is not about design, it's about craftsmanship, and therefore logically it applies to the entire menorah. Because craftsmanship is something that's across the board on a project. You're not buying a piece of art that's half Picasso and half Rembrandt, or half amateur. If it's a Picasso, it's a Picasso. If it's craftsmanship, then the whole menorah is craftsmanship. This is an important point, I think. If it's a design element, you can't add design elements. There's a certain amount of goblets, a certain amount of knobs, a certain amount of flowers. You can't say, I want to put peaches. That would be terrible, sacrilegious, problematic. But if the Torah says the craftsmanship should be on the highest level, another example by menorah is that it should all be chiseled out from one piece. Should we say that part of the menorah should not be? The craftsmanship is on that level. Of course it should be everywhere. Alternatively, the Rebbe says, just to be safe, is the last point, that even though partially it's required, the rest is recommended for the mitzvah of beautifying a mitzvah. But either way, it's now logical to say that it's across the board. I want to point out that earlier when we gave the answer of the other commentaries, the second answer was similar to this of the other commentaries, Kiryas Sefer, etc., and the Malbim, namely that it makes sense that it should be symmetrical, that this beautification should be across the board. And the Rebbe even says in the footnote that this interpretation goes hand in hand with that one, but it's light years ahead though. In that commentary, they're just saying, heck, let's make it symmetrical. All right, like why? Here we're saying they had to make it symmetrical. It's impossible that this should really have been a doubt, because there's no doubts about reality that's seen in front of your eyes for 800 years. That's the innovation of this Sicha. And therefore, clearly, whatever was done was always done. And Rambam says, I know there was always done, all of it. So the whole concept of the ambiguity, of the inconclusivity of the verse is only regarding the literary level of it, but not the legal level of it. on a literal level, argue from today till tomorrow which part of the menorah the Torah explicitly said it about. But clearly it applies to everything because that's the principle. When you're talking about craftsmanship, it's across the board. Or at a minimum, to do the mitzvah of beautifying the mitzvah. Ooh, it's long. I want to conclude with a lesson. The Sicha doesn't give a lesson. So what I'm saying now is completely arbitrary. It's on my own shoulders. When you learn such a long, involved Sicha, hopefully you want to walk away with some kind of emotional, spiritual instruction. So what I'm saying has some basis based on other Sichas, but it's not explicit in the Sicha at all. And that is this. We're talking about the menorah. The menorah is a representation of Torah. It's the light. The light of our lives is the Torah. And the question is, and the menorah is supposed to be beautiful, engraved. The Torah is beautiful. The Torah is what beautifies us and makes us live a beautiful life, makes us live a special life, engraved, fancy. I have a daughter-in-law and grandchildren who are from England. Fancy. The menorah should be fancy. Means special. Which part of the menorah, which part of the Torah, in the menorah itself, you have goblets, and then you have flowers and knobs. Flowers and knobs represent spiritually, this is brought in other talks, your own beautification. You're a Torah Jew, you're doing the mitzvahs, you're studying Torah. It's your flowers and your knobs. It's your own beautification. The goblets, conversely, they represent the fact that you teach other Jews. Notice the goblets were not right side up, they were upside down, that the menorah light. You know what it means to be a Torah Jew? That you share Torah with other people. You don't just hold on to it yourself. That's what a Torah Jew means. The question is, which is the main part? Which is the fanciness of the menorah? Which is the beautification, the engraving of the menorah? Does it apply to the goblets or does it apply to the flowers and knobs? Translation, what is most special about being a Torah Jew, about being a menorah, about living in the light? Is it about the fact that you're making yourself beautiful and spiritual and moral and ethical and kosher and living in the light of Hashem? Your flower knob part? Or is it about the fact that you're sharing it with another Jew? Both are important. It's inconclusive because you need both. In fact, when we teach Torah to another Jew, that's when we grow. That's when we gain. That's the best way to inspire ourselves. My father, God bless him, should be well and healthy. He used to tell us a story when the Rabbi innovated the concept of mitzvah in the mitzvah campaigns back in the 70s. We were kids, and this became the Chabad thing. Excuse me, are you Jewish? Do you light Shabbos candles? Do you put on tefillin? You can't just have your own tefillin. You got to share with another Jew. This became the Chabad thing. So my father would tell us the following story, that a man is traveling through this, trekking on foot, in the wilderness. Let's assume his wagon broke or whatever, and he's trekking on foot, and he's got a long way to go, and it's frozen winter. But he's getting really, really tired. And he knows to get to the next city, he's got to walk another 5 hours, and he can't take another step. Long story short, he's arguing with himself, and he's fighting with himself because he's very tired. He wants to take a rest, but he knows if he sits down on the snow, he's going to freeze within 10 minutes, and that's it. Yiskadal v'yiskadash. So he fights with his brain. He doesn't allow himself to get drowsy, and he's dizzy. You know what I mean? Try to envision yourself trekking for hours on end in the freezing cold. You're alone. You're schlepping your bags. And in your mind, you need to keep going, but your body, it says otherwise. And you keep saying, take a little rest, but no, it spells death. But eventually it gets the better of him. He can't. And he says, against his better judgment, he tells himself, let me take a little short rest by this tree. I'm going to take a little 5-minute nap, and then I'll go. I'm going to make sure I don't fall asleep. And again, he's dreaming. Of course he's going to fall asleep, and that's going to be the end. But he can't keep his eyes open. So he sits down by the tree, and he starts moving away some snow. But in the snow, he feels a body. He moves away the snow, and the guy has a pulse. There's somebody freezing to death under the snow, and his pulse is still there. Are you kidding? He jumps into action. He pulls the guy out. He shakes him up. He throws him on his shoulder, and he runs to the city, and he saves him and himself. My father, God should be healthy and well for many more years till Mashiach and beyond. He would always tell us this story that the Rebbe made us into goblets, into teachers of Torah. If you're a Chabadnik and if you're associated with the Rebbe, if you know Aleph, you teach Aleph. You know Beis, you teach Beis. The Rebbe would quote his predecessors. It's not enough just to be a flower and a knob to beautify your menorah. You got to be a goblet. You got to be sharing with another Yid. And it goes hand in hand with your own beautification. It's part of your own menorah. Which way is the fanciness? Which way is the engraving and the main element of the menorah? We don't know. Both. If you study your own Torah and do your own mitzvahs, and at the same time, whenever you have a chance, you share with another Jew. The sharing with the other Jew will make your beautification, and vice versa. The more you study Torah, the more you could share. It goes both ways. It's ambiguous. The verse is not conclusive. You can't have one without the other. This is my own interpretation, but I think there's certainly a lesson to it in it. There maybe there's some truth to it. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for joining me.